Hey listeners, this is Ben, the Amateur Exegete, and you're listening to episode 40 of Bible Study for Amateurs. Today's episode is Self-Designations in the Acts of the Apostles. The Acts of the Apostles represents one of the earliest conscious attempts by Christians to narrate the early history of their movement. Written sometime in the early 2nd century, the book of Acts tells the story of how a small community of Jesus followers, centered in Jerusalem, blossomed and ballooned into a global movement, at least by Greco-Roman standards, that made its way all the way to the capital of the empire. There is considerable debate over just what kind of work the book of Acts is, but that doesn't interest us in this episode. Whatever it is not an impartial, objective look at the earliest stages of the Jesus-following movement. Instead, Acts is a carefully crafted volume that paints a very specific portrait of the movement. One of the ways in which the author of Acts does this is by self-designations, terms used by Jesus' followers to describe themselves. Paul Trebilco, professor of New Testament at the University of Otago in New Zealand, wrote on this very thing for Novum Testamentum in 2012 entitled, "The Significance of the Distribution of Self-Designations in Acts." The paper examines not only the ways in which Jesus' followers refer to themselves in the Acts of the Apostles, but also how they are distributed and its significance. Trebilco considers 5 designations: adelphoi, often rendered as brothers or brothers and sisters; mathetai, translated as disciples; ecclesia, church, or better, assembly; the believers; and finally, the saints, or sanctified ones. I will argue, he writes, that in a range of cases there are either theological or historical reasons why Luke uses particular self-designations in particular places or ways. Overall, I hope to show that Luke is very careful in his use of these self-designations. And he begins with mathetai. In Mark's Gospel, the 12 cease to be called mathetai, disciples, after Mark chapter 14, verse 32. Here's that verse from the NRSV. "They went to a place called Gethsemane, and he said to his disciples, 'Sit here while I pray.'" In the pericope prior, Jesus tells his disciples that they will all become deserters. Peter objects, stating that he alone will never abandon his master. But even Peter, Jesus says, will forsake him. Mark is very careful in his use of mathetai, writes Trebilco. They cease to be mathetai from 1432 onwards, but restoration is promised in chapter 16, verse 7. Luke, one of Mark's earliest interpreters, follows suit and does not use mathetai after Luke chapter 22, verse 45. It isn't until Acts chapter 6, verse 1 that the term resurfaces. The next term Trebilco looks at is adelphoi, a term often rendered as either brothers or brothers and sisters, and is used over 50 times in a metaphorical sense. Trebilco notes that adelphoi is used by Jewish characters to describe their fellow Jews and by Jewish Jesus followers to describe other Jewish Jesus followers. A significant new usage is introduced in Acts chapter 15, verse 1 and 15 verses 22 through 23, he writes. Here's Acts chapter 15, verse 1 from the NRSV. "Then certain individuals came down from Judea and were teaching the brothers, Unless you are circumcised according to the custom of Moses, you cannot be saved. What is interesting here is that these Judean evangelists must be addressing non-Jews, since Jewish followers of Jesus would have been circumcised from a young age. Gentiles, however, would not have been. This represents the first time the author of Acts uses adelphoi to describe Gentile followers of Jesus. But why this delay? There were obviously some non-Jewish Jesus followers before this point. Trebilco thinks it has to do with the council held at Jerusalem, in which Peter and James make it clear that God has offered salvation to Gentiles apart from the law of Moses. They are now members of the fictive family. They are brothers and sisters, adelphoi. But Trebilco also points out that this is all Luke. Paul had no problem referring to Gentiles as adelphoi, doing so in places like 1 Thessalonians chapter 1 verse 4, Galatians chapter 1 verse 2, and more. Accordingly, he writes, adelphoi carries significant theological freight for Luke. Trebilco returns to mathetai in Acts, having already briefly looked at its usage in the Gospel of Luke. He begins with the observation that Luke uses the term to speak of all Christians who may be gathered in a particular place. One of the examples he gives is Acts chapter 6 verse 1 and 2, which describes an increasing number of disciples as well as the whole community of disciples. He also points to the term's widespread geographic application, being used to describe Christians in Jerusalem, Damascus, Joppa, Antioch, and so on. It is not just the 12 who were the disciples, but all those who became followers of Jesus. Trebilco also notes that, with but one exception, none of the characters in the Acts of the Apostles address others with mathetai, or even use the term at all. It is the narrator who does so. And Trebilco thinks that this is because the author knew that this was not a term they themselves would have used. Corroborating this is the fact that Paul never uses mathetai, nor does any book of the New Testament outside the Gospels and Acts. This fits with Trebilco's thesis that the author of Acts is careful about the terminology he uses to describe the earliest stages of the Jesus-following community. He knew they didn't refer to themselves as mathetai, and so he, for the most part, refrains from having characters within the story world use it. The next set of terms Trebilco considers are so-called believer designations. These are often comprised of a participial form of the verb pisteuo, to believe. He notes that such designations are pre-Pauline, stretching back to the earliest strata of the Jesus-following movement. Paul uses hoi pisteuantes, the believing ones, in many of his epistles, including Romans, a community that he did not found. Early on in Acts, believer designations appear in chapter 2 verse 44, chapter 4 verse 32, and chapter 5 verse 14. Trebilco notes that these examples are from the narrator and not from characters in the story. The use of such believer designations progresses in Acts, particularly when Gentile characters and Greek-speaking Jews are introduced. For Trebilco, this suggests that believer designations were used relatively early and, in his words, first developed in a Greek-speaking setting outside of Jerusalem. So far, Trebilco has considered 3 terms: adelphoi, brothers or brothers and sisters, mathetai, disciples, and believer designations. He now moves on to ecclesia, church, or better yet, assembly. Per Trebilco, ecclesia appears some 23 times in the Acts of the Apostles, 19 times with reference to Christian assemblies, 3 times to a city assembly, and once for Israel. The term appears to have been used early on, given its usage by Paul in his letters. Some evidence suggests that it was first used by Hellenists in Jerusalem, including the distinct possibility that Paul spent most of his time harassing Greek-speaking Jesus followers, based on his letters, as well as the lack of any evidence that there is an underlying Aramaic term behind the usage of ecclesia. It seems to be very Greek. Trebilco also notes that ecclesia, when it refers to the Christ-following community, is, with only one exception, a term used by the narrator, and not the characters of Acts. This, of course, doesn't necessarily mean the author of Acts thought it was not used by the earliest believers, since we have other evidence to suggest otherwise. Instead, Trebilco thinks it is because, in part, of the meaning of the term as a designation for a group, and therefore would be more likely used by a narrator who summarizes than a character who talks. But there is other evidence to consider, particularly the distribution of the term in the book of Acts. The first time the term is used to describe a Jesus-following community is in Acts chapter 5, verse 11, where it refers to the assembly in Jerusalem. But this is interesting. In chapters 1 through 4 of Acts, the author uses a variety of terms to refer to Jesus followers, but not ecclesia. Why? Why is the author careful to avoid using it? Trebilco thinks it's because it wasn't used at the outset, and so the author of Acts' actual usage reflects the historical development of the use of the term ecclesia. The final designation Trebilco considers is that of hoi hagioi, the saints, or sanctified ones. Readers of the New Testament recognize this term since it is found all over the place. Paul uses it nearly 40 times, and the book of Revelation over a dozen. You only find it 4 times in Acts, however, beginning with Acts chapter 9, verse 13, with Ananias' vision. However, the author of Acts uses a participial form of the cognate hagiadzo that in many ways functions the same way as hoi hagioi. Trebilco notes that the author of Acts uses hoi hagioi exclusively with regard to those believers in Jerusalem and the surrounding area, while he uses the participial form of hagiadzo with reference to Paul and so-called Pauline Christians. This usage, Trebilco suggests, reflects historical reality. This paper covers a lot of ground, and listeners are encouraged to grab a copy and read it for themselves, since I simply cannot do it justice here. I think Trebilco does a good job showing that Luke is motivated by both historical and theological interests, and I think this points us to the fact that, whatever else Luke may have been, he was an author whose writing deserves to be studied. That's all the time we've got this week. See you next time, and remember, in the words of Richard Elliott Friedman, one does not need to deny what is troubling about the Bible in order to pay respect to what is heartening. Thanks for listening.